Excuse me. The Apocalypse Crusade, War of the Undead, Day 1. A Zombie Tale by Peter Meredith. Written by Peter Meredith. Narrated by Eric Johnson. Chapter 1. Benny hesitated, his foot coming off the gas to hover over the brake, his instincts to help someone in need, fighting against his better judgment and a natural inclination to laziness. Then, seconds later, it was too late. The girl on the side of the road was behind him, and just a diminishing blur in his rain-streaked mirror. She had seemed very small. Ah, crap, he whined, his foot still uncommitted. He was a thin man, and would have been considered short if not for his neck, which resembled that of a turkey's, long, thin, and ringed. Just then it was torqued around as he tried to squint into the night. He had never stopped for hitchhikers. It was stupid and dangerous. Yet this one had been simply a girl. Yeah, but I'm already late. He had downed 3 too many beers, and now it was after 1 in the morning. In his mind, he knew Jane would be waiting up. She wouldn't greet him with a kiss. Instead, she'd nag. "Where have you been? How much have you had to drink?" She'd ask even though she knew exactly where he'd been, and that he drank too much. He was late, it was cold, his wife would kill him. These rationalizations against doing the right thing failed when he thought how small the girl on the side of the road was. She had to be freezing out there, and was probably scared out of her wits. He was on an upslope, and without gas pushing his aging Jeep Liberty, he was slowing rapidly. Behind him, down the hill, the girl was only a wavy, ghost-like figure in white. "She's probably a runaway," he said to himself, as further argument to just keep going. Runaways meant all sorts of trouble. Drugs, thievery, maybe even prostitution. Why would he want to bring that sort of mess home to the wife? The Liberty was now crawling along, and his foot went to the gas. But a last thought went through his head. What if someone else picked her up? Someone not so nice as Benny Robinson. A pedophile, maybe, or a rapist, or, God forbid, a serial killer. He sighed long and wearily before putting the Liberty in reverse. It hummed back toward the girl, who was standing in the same place, drenched to the bone. She didn't even look toward the car heading right for her. "Fuck, she's on drugs for sure," he said. Benny was all set to regret his decision to come back for her, until he saw how fantastically young she was. She didn't look any older than 8. "Fuck," he said again, this time slowly, letting the word draw out until he had backed the Liberty to a stop right in front of her. He leaned over the e-brake and opened the passenger side door, expecting her to jump in. However, she didn't. She only stood there wearing nothing but a hospital gown that clung to her skinny body. "Get in!" he yelled to her over the downpour and the slapping rhythm of the windshield wipers. She didn't budge. "It'll be okay," he cried louder. "I won't hurt you." She swayed for a few moments and then moved with awkward and jerky motions. It was bizarre. She was bizarre. For some reason, she stepped up onto the seat instead of sitting on it. It was like watching a mannequin that had come to life. "No, step down there. Not on the seat. Put your foot down there," he said, trying to guide her without being too touchy. He was afraid that she would bolt, and he didn't like the idea of having to run around the forest trying to catch her. When she had finally folded herself properly into the car, he asked, "You okay?" "I'm fine." The 2 words crawled out of a phlegmy throat in a low growl. The answer had been given an automatic reply, given without any thought whatsoever. Benny guessed there wasn't much going on in that bedraggled blonde head. She sat staring straight ahead, her mouth partially open, her eyes dull and unfocused. He glanced back up the road, wondering where the hell she had come from. There wasn't a hospital anywhere around there as far as he knew. He was just west of Hartford, Connecticut, on a lonely stretch of road. There wasn't much around them but trees and a whole lot of rain. With his long turkey neck twisted back, his eyes fell on the gym bag he had thrown onto the rear seat. He started to reach for it, but stopped as the girl finally came to life. Her head quivered on her neck, and she bared her teeth like an animal about to attack. Freaky, Benny thought. It was as though she wanted nothing more than to tear out one of his ribs with her small, feral teeth. If he had to guess, what with the hospital gown and all the weirdness, he supposed he was dealing with some sort of mental case. But where there was a loony bin around there, he didn't know. "It's okay," he said, bringing up the bag nice and slow so as to not freak her out anymore. "I'm getting you a jacket to keep you warm." In answer, she pulled her lips back even further, and in the dark, her mouth seemed strangely virile and hungry. Her hands started opening and closing, and she bunched in her seat, again like an animal ready to spring. "Okay, you don't want a jacket? That's fine, I'll just turn up the heat." With exaggerated movements, he turned the heat up to its highest setting. "Is that better?" The question confused her. She started rocking, staring out the front window, making a gurgling sound deep in her throat. Benny gave a little cough. "My name is Benny, or Ben, if that's easier. What's your name?" She didn't answer. Instead, she balled her hands into fists, and her eyes grew large as if she were about to explode. Though it was dark inside the Jeep Liberty, he couldn't help but notice that there was something wrong with the girl's eyes. They were very dark. The pupils were deep pits and seemed to be the size of quarters. The whites of her eyes were like those of a frightened horse. They were two little crescents below those black pits. "You don't look so good," Benny said, putting the car in gear. "I think I'll take you." He stopped in mid-sentence as her chin, a little point of a thing in her heart-shaped face, jerked in his direction. Her lips were curled into a snarl. "Just relax, it'll be okay," he said, holding out a hand to her. She struck at it fast as a spitting snake, drawing blood with her ragged nails. She went to strike again, and that was when he saw that she had part of an IV sticking out of her arm. Thick black blood oozed from it. He pulled his hand back. "You need to settle down," he said sharply, "or I'll kick your ass out. You don't want that." When Benny had seen what sort of shape the girl was in, he had figured he would find the nearest hospital for her. Now he changed his mind. There was a state trooper station not far down the road. In 10 minutes, she was going to be their problem. He went heavy on the gas, one eye on the road, and one eye on the girl, who had begun to pant. The rain picked up, thrumming hard on the roof. When he jacked the wipers to full speed, she panted faster, as if trying to keep time. Despite all this, Ben wasn't afraid. She was probably no more than 50 pounds after all. What he felt most was some sort of instinctual disgust. He was repulsed by her on a gut level, and when a passing truck illuminated the interior of the Liberty, that revulsion went beyond the subconscious. Benny gave a glance at the girl and did a double take. He had thought she was a dirty blonde, but now he saw her hair was so pale it was practically white. It was on her scalp where the dark color showed through. Her skin was black with what looked like dirt, and there was more of it in her ears and down the back of her neck. But it couldn't have been dirt. Not with all the rain. It resembled black lichen, or maybe mold. "Thudum, thudum, thudum." "Whoa," Benny said under his breath. The Liberty had drifted to the shoulder of the road while he had been staring at the girl. He corrected his course and then glanced at her and saw that now she was staring back. Or rather, she was glaring at him in hatred. "Don't stare, bitch," she said. Her words had come growling up from deep in her throat. "Sorry, I'm just worried about you." He glanced again at her in mid-sentence, and she screeched over his words. "No! Don't stare!" "Fine," he said, swinging his eyes back to the road and subconsciously accelerating. As much as he wanted them to, his eyes wouldn't stay focused on the road. Benny likened it to driving with an angry cheetah in the seat next to him, and of course, he had to sneak another look. "No!" the girl screamed, and then launched herself at him. Her right hand grabbed the steering wheel. Her left raked across his bare arm as she pulled herself towards him, her greedy teeth searching hungrily for his neck. In that split second, he saw her gums were black like a dog's, and that her tongue was coated with that same filthy, awful mold. She was strong for her size, but still light compared to him, so he was able to hold her back from his throat. Her teeth snapped and gnashed in the air just inches from the soft skin of his neck. She was absolutely wild, and with some justification, his right hand found her neck, and he squeezed without regard for her age or her sex. He squeezed hard, hoping she would respond to the pain. She ignored the fact that he was crushing her windpipe. All she cared about was tearing a chunk out of his flesh. Like some sort of snake, she twisted and slithered in order to get at him. With a long grunt, he forced her back and held her at arm's length. Her right hand had never left the wheel, which meant thudum, thudum, thudum. The sound was urgent, loud, and brief. In the second before the crash, Benny was filled with the dreadful knowledge that he had strayed too far over the edge of the road, and that with this little fiend attacking him, he'd never be able to right the vehicle quickly enough. In slow motion, he turned from the monstrous thing he had by the neck and saw that the Liberty was pointed straight toward a steep embankment. Benny had been doing 70 in rain-slicked conditions, and now he slammed on the brakes. They locked up tight, and with dirt under the front wheels and wet pavement under the back, the Liberty spun. Benny knew how to turn into a skid. However, his world had become a merry-go-round of flashing white teeth, of rain running sideways, and of black forests going in every direction. He hesitated a half-second too long, and then it was too late. The Liberty went off the road and began to roll. During the first rotation, every window blew out, and the roof crumpled down 4 inches. The girl let go of his arm to go ping-ponging around the interior of the car sometime during the second rotation. In the middle of the third, something struck the crown of Benny's head, and the world went soundlessly black. When he awoke, the night was quiet, save for the steady ticking of the cooling engine and the pitter-patter of the rain. It was coming in through the front where the windshield had been, and was striking him square in the face. The angle was strange. Didn't make sense until he realized that the Liberty had settled on its rear quarter. It was nose up in a sharp gully. Benny tried to move, to look around, but a terrific pain engulfing his right neck and shoulders stopped him. With a shaking left hand, he explored where the pain was greatest and felt something jagged coming up through the collar of his shirt. It was his clavicle, and it was an absolute misery to touch. "Oh, God," he whispered, wondering how the hell he was going to get out of there when he could barely move. He began feeling around the door with his left hand when something behind and below him at the bottom of the car stirred. It was the girl. It hurt like a beast to turn his head so far around, but he was suddenly petrified of the little girl. In those last few seconds before the crash, it was as though she had changed. She had stopped being human and had become a... His mind wanted to reject the word monster, but it fit far too well. He remembered he had squeezed her throat so hard that it would have crushed the larynx of a normal girl, but she hadn't even blinked. With a whiny moan in his own throat, he turned and saw that the girl had been injured as well. Along with many gashes and wounds, her left arm was folded beneath her at a horrible angle. Her elbow had been broken in the crash, and now it bent the wrong way. Her flesh was split open from the unnatural position, and there was something dull and white showing through that resembled the cartilage off the end of a chicken drumstick. The sight of it, even more than his own injury, made him want to puke. The feeling grew worse when she ignored her mangled limb altogether and climbed to her feet. For a second, she stood where the back window had been, her bare feet in mud. Then she started to climb, baring her teeth and drooling as though hungry. Her eyes were all black now. "No!" Benny screamed. He tried to turn. He tried to get away, but his right side was practically paralyzed, and he couldn't reach his seatbelt with his left hand. In desperation, he looked around for a weapon, anything he could use to stop this horrible creature, but there was nothing. Then she was on him, her small teeth tearing into his neck, her body shaking like a terrier with a rat, until she tore off a chunk of hot flesh. With Benny howling in misery and uselessly calling for help, she chewed the flesh of his neck, slurped the hot blood, swallowed, and went back for more. Chapter 2. The Staff, RNK Research Center. 1.
"Allow me, Dr. Liggs. It would be honor to log all data for you."
Eng's words were choppy. His L's and R's turned on his tongue, giving them the stereotypical Chinese mispronunciation. He didn't seem to notice or care. He sat in his stainless steel chair, grinning up at his boss, like an eager child, or a simpleton. "Are you sure?" Jim Riggs asked. The question might as well have been rhetorical, since Riggs knew the answer, just like he had known that Eng was going to offer to log the data in the first place, simply because he always offered. And Riggs always allowed him to. The man seemed to love every aspect of the research project, even the dull-as-hell shit work, all of which was just fine with Riggs, who had already had his afternoon planned. Another attempt at Dr. Milner's new research assistant, whose white lab coat could barely contain all that she had to offer. If that didn't bear fruit, then a round of golf sounded nice.
My pleasure,
Eng said with a short bow of his head, letting his black hair fall in front of his face. Culturally, the Chinese generally only bow in very formal situations. However, since it never failed to please his superiors, Eng was a frequent bower. He bowed in the cafeteria, in the parking garage, and to everyone's amusement, in the bathroom.
I enjoy data. It's where we find cure, okay? Cancer is most horrible of disease, our work of much great importance.
Riggs nodded solemnly, hiding a look that suggested Eng was a complete sucker. What he didn't bother to hide was his condescension. It was far too ingrained. He considered Eng to be a very poor scientist and had very little respect for him. The man had no imagination, no insight beyond the ordinary. He seemed unable to make the intuitive leaps that would allow for the big breakthrough, which every real scientist strove for. But he was hell at cataloging data, and would fetch coffee as if he were being timed. "Have at it," Riggs said, trying to catch his reflection. He was tall, so he had to bend at the waist to look into the glass of one of the cabinets, checking his ghostly appearance. After turning his head this way and that, he patted Eng on the back, saying, "I know you'll do a great job," before walking out of his lab wearing a smile. When the door shut, Eng made a face. "Hong Mao Waiter," he whispered, literally meaning red-furred devil, a common Mandarin slur used to denigrate Caucasians. Since Riggs was blond and very pale from spending all his days under the harsh fluorescent lab lights, white-furred devil would have been more accurate. With a snort of contempt, Eng bent to his task, but had barely begun when the door opened again. It was Dr. Tui Li. Eng felt his heart do a little jump in his chest, but he made sure not to react beyond reaching up to ensure his hair was in place.
Where's Riggs?
She demanded. She didn't smile. Eng didn't either, though he wished he could. He also wished he could kiss her or touch the silk-like black hair that hung halfway down her back, or gather the courage to ask her out, again. The first time had been a disaster. Some months before, in a moment of weakness, he had opened his heart to her, and she had casually stomped her 4-inch stilettos right down on it. Neither had forgotten the incident, though both acted as if it had never happened.
Dr. Riggs is most very busy with great research project,
he said. Dr. Lee's dark and slightly slanted eyes closed to slits.
Why do you insist on talking like that, Mr. Eng? You sound like an idiot.
He bowed his head in acknowledgement, which only made her angrier.
And enough with the bowing! All you're doing is reinforcing a stupid stereotype. There's some idiot in procuring who bows every time he sees me. You have him thinking that's what all Asians do.
My apologies, Miss Doctoral Triri, he said, butchering her name the same as always and making her want to spit nails. It didn't matter that her own mother had a similar accent. She was old. She had an excuse. Through gritted teeth, she said,
"One more time, Eng. My first name is pronounced Twee. Say it slowly. Twee. There's no R in Twee, but there is an L in Lee right at the beginning. Twee Lee. If you're going to make it in America, you're going to have to master these simple things. Now, tell me, where the hell is Riggs conducting his so-called great research project if he's not doing it in his own lab?"
Eng shrugged as only a recent Chinese immigrant would, with an exaggerated motion and a dreadfully fake look of pure innocence.
"Uh-huh,"
Dr. Lee said, dryly. She pursed her full lips, thinking. When she did, it showed off her high cheekbones, and in Eng's mind made her look even more like a model from a magazine. He stared out of the corner of his eyes until she clucked her tongue.
"I bet he's trying his luck with that dippy Anna again. How they get anything done over there is beyond me. It's like Milner's trying to create a harem for himself."
Dale Milner was as unquestionably brilliant as he was pervy, which was how he was able to fund his harem. Twee had 3 research assistants, whom she had carefully screened for competence. Riggs only had 2, but, since he worked Eng like a 19th century coolie, he didn't need more. Twee glanced at the stack of work Riggs had left Eng to catalog. It was 2 feet tall, and she guessed that he would be at it well after dark. For a second, pity entered her cold heart.
"Thanks for your time, and have a good afternoon, Mr. Eng,"
she said, giving him the smallest of smiles.
"Goodbye, Miss Doctoral Ree,"
he replied as though he had a mouthful of marbles.
Her tiny smile dropped away to nothing as she turned for the door. She didn't think he had seen. However, Eng, who was far more observant than he let on, noted it. When the door shut, he murmured, "Goodbye, Dr. Lee," this time in perfect English. "Have a good day, Dr. Lee. Kiss my ass, Dr. Lee." Angrily, he looked at the stack of reports, wishing he could drop them into the nearest incinerator. More than that, he wished he could show Dr. Lee who he really was and what he was really capable of. "No," he said, taking deep breaths and calming by degrees. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." It took a few more seconds of deep breathing to shrug off the interruption, and then he went back to work, logging the data on the latest round of Track 3 tests. As Dr. Lee had figured, it took hours for him to complete it all. Once the cataloging was complete, transferring a copy of the data to the facility's mainframe took less than a minute. His next assignment took much longer. The data had to be encrypted, compressed, and zipped before it was loaded onto a flash drive. Later that night, Eng would visit his favorite McDonald's, where the flash drive would be left in a wrapper of his Big Mac, sitting innocently enough on his tray. Who picked it up from there he didn't know, and he didn't want to know. All that mattered was that eventually it would end up in the hands of Lieutenant Eng's station chief. From there it would be forwarded on to China, just as all the other data he had ever touched had been. 2. Dr. Lee left Eng feeling a need to wash her hands. He was a greasy man with a greasy smile, and there was something about his eyes that bothered her. It was something hidden. She assumed it was some sick sexual perversion, and in that, she was only partially correct. With her 4-inch heels clacking along the white-tiled hallways, she made her way to the Track 2 lab, where Dr. Dale Milner held forth like some petty noble in a petty kingdom. Dr. Lee was thankful the man had already been informed of the impromptu meeting. He was insufferable in his lab, and rarely left it. The same could not be said of Dr. Riggs, whom she found in the front room of Milner's lab, leaning against a stainless steel table, with his elbow on an expensive centrifuge and laughing it up with Anna Holloway. She was one of Milner's hotter assistants, and Riggs could barely contain himself as he let his eyes slip and slide along the soft curves of her cleavage. "Twee!" Riggs exclaimed delightedly. Dr. Lee could only assume that Anna's perfume had gone to his head, as he was not the least bit subtle as he turned from one beauty to the other. His eyes ran up and down Twee's trim form as though she were a stripper and not a PhD. "Hello, Dr. Lee," Anna said, swinging her head so that her long blonde hair unfurled from her right shoulder to come to a gentle rest on her left, where it rippled like a golden river. She flipped her hair frequently, acting as though she thought it rude to let her hair come between her and the person she was addressing. "Dr. Milner isn't here. He hasn't come back from lunch yet." Twee knew this already. "Yes, he's in a meeting concerning the fate of the ComCell project. I'm here to collect Dr. Riggs for the same purpose." Riggs, who had been having a grand time chatting up Anna without Milner around to spoil it, felt his smile falter. He knew all too well that it wasn't normal for a senior research fellow to be sent to collect a colleague. "Is it a status meeting? Or is it funding? Was it Rothschild or Kip who called it? Son of a bitch!" He cursed, jumping up and rushing for the door with his lab coat flapping. "I hate when they spring these sorts of things on us!" Twee had followed him out, but she didn't answer his question. Instead, she cleared her throat and jerked her head back to the lab. "Don't you want to say a proper goodbye?" "Ah, shit!" he exclaimed, and then turned on the spot and ran back to the door. "Sorry about that, Anna. The senior partners are up to their old tricks, springing surprise meetings on us like we have nothing better to do." "You don't seem to have anything better to do," Twee remarked. Riggs smiled tight. "I'll see you later, Anna. Maybe down at Hot Jack's pub after work?" "Maybe," she allowed. Twee took Riggs by the elbow and pulled him from the door. Anna's coy smile and her maybe had dislodged his fear of the senior partners. Riggs smiled down at Dr. Lee as they hurried for the elevators. "You cut that goodbye a little short. Getting jealous, Twee? If so, you don't have to be. There's enough of me to go around." "Maybe not after this next meeting," she cracked. Again, his smile faltered. "What do you know?" "Same as you. They want a meeting of all the track investigators."
Just like Dr. Lee, his actual title was Independent Research Investigator, but like most, he preferred the term Research Fellow instead. He complained that the word investigator made him sound like a private eye.
It can't be funding, it's just too early,
Riggs said, trying to convince himself. He started to get a squirmy feeling of anxiety in his gut. Because what if it wasn't? What if their progress wasn't what the partners were expecting? What if they wanted more? Kip was like that. The man was never happy with results until the pills were on the shelves. It was Dr. Lee who should have been sweating bullets. However, she was her usual cool, composed self.
We'll find out in a minute,
she said, as though they were just out for a stroll.
It's gotta be a status meeting, Riggs decided. And that's fine with me. Did you hear about my latest round of possum tests? 40%!
The same as your last test, Twee noted.
Yes, that's called consistency, Riggs replied. And Kip likes consistency.
They came to the elevators, and, because there were a few other people waiting, they dropped their conversation. Once on, Twee hit the button for the top floor, and neither spoke until the last person exited on the 5th floor.
And what did you learn from your consistent tests? Twee asked. If your answer is nothing, then the second test was a waste of time.
Riggs, who didn't feel the need to justify his work, simply answered,
We're still compiling the data.
We meant Aang was compiling the data.
What about you? I heard your first round was a complete flop, and your second was only slightly better. I told you fusarium mycotoxins were too weak. The most you'll do is give the tumors the sniffles.
My first round proved just that, Dr. Lee said, easily. Too easily for Riggs to be comfortable with. It was as though she was keeper of some great secret.
What about your second round?
He asked as the elevator doors hissed open.
What did you learn?
Twee didn't answer. Instead, she smiled at the two women who manned the 10th floor reception desk. The lady on the right, Laura England, was just shy of 40 and beautiful in a mature sort of way. The term MILF was bandied about quite a bit in the lab lines on the 3rd floor, where the newbie scientists with lesser pedigrees competed to get noticed. Mrs. England was Dr. Kipling's secretary. She didn't know it, but she only had another year or two left. Unless Kip managed to get into her panties quicker, then it would be a considerably shorter time. The woman on the left, Dr. Rothschild's personal secretary, Abigail Unger, might have been beautiful decades before. Now she was the matriarch of R&K Pharmaceuticals and the epitome of a Rothschild worker, competent, loyal, and always plodding forward.
You're late,
Mrs. Unger intoned, her lips drawn down in a frown, what was practically a permanent feature on her face.
In Dr. Kipling's office, please.
Riggs groaned. He had been hoping that Rothschild would be running the meeting. With Kip, he knew that whatever was coming, good or bad, was going to be a headache.
After you, Dr. Lee,
Riggs said, opening the door to Stephen Kipling's palatial-sized office. Not only was it palatial in its dimensions, it was also palatial in accommodations. In the center of the room was an oval-shaped table that could sit 30 people, though currently it held just 10, congregated at the far end. The two principals were there, kindly old Rothschild, who needed only a red suit and an extra 20 pounds to make him resemble a mall Santa, and Kipling, who was dapper as always in a 3-piece Armani. The other 6 track investigators were there, looking ill at ease in their lab coats, sitting stiffly in the humongous high-backed leather chairs. The other 2 men at the table were as different from each other as night and day. The first was a slight man in a gray suit, sporting a nervous smile and a mustache of sweat across his upper lip. It was Jim Hartman, who headed up the procurement division. He was notoriously stingy, which was why Kip kept him around, despite receiving complaints from every scientist who had ever walked through the gleaming R&K doors. The second man was unknown to Riggs or Twee. He was tall, with muscles that stretched the fabric of his suit jacket at the biceps and shoulders. He was somewhere in his late 30s and had quick eyes. They were a soft brown in color, but were sharp. Clearly, he wasn't a scientist. First off, he sported a warm tan, which meant he didn't spend his days with his nose pressed against a microscope. Secondly, there was his build. It was somewhat of a rule that true scientists couldn't wield their slide rulers without getting winded, and this guy looked like he could twist Riggs into a pretzel and not break a sweat. Riggs immediately pegged him as security, which didn't bode well at all. It either meant that something had leaked or that the paranoia factor of the bosses was ramping up. Neither was good. Inwardly, he cursed, while outwardly, he ignored the security man completely and brought out his most genuine fake smile. "It's good to see you, Kip, and you, Dr. Rothschild." Kip returned the fake smile with equal sincerity. He gave a warmer one to Twee, asking her, "Where was the good doctor?" "As if we don't know," Dr. Milner interjected before Twee could do more than open her mouth. Several of the other scientists smiled at this. Behind her, Riggs cleared his throat and gripped her shoulders tighter. Twee, who felt as though Dr. Riggs had been using her as a human shield since they had entered the room, replied to Milner, "In the cafeteria, about to sit down for a late lunch." Riggs tried not to let his surprise show as he escorted Twee to her chair and pulled it out for her, something he never did. Rothschild watched the display of manners with a gentle smile on his wrinkled face, while Kip waited with ill-disguised impatience until Riggs took his own spot at the table. Then he displayed his trademark smile that was supposed to put everyone at ease. It didn't fool any of the regulars at the meeting. A smile from Stephen Kipling could mean anything, from a promotion to a diagnosis of a terminal ailment. The Chinese symbol for crisis, as some of you know, is the combination of the characters for danger and opportunity. Here, Kip paused and nodded to Dr. Lee. She was half Vietnamese and half American GI, and despite her extensive education, she didn't know one Chinese symbol from another. Still, she nodded back in an attempt to get Kip's focus off of her. "Crisis!" he exclaimed with a fist held in front of his chest. "It's where we find ourselves today, in the midst of danger and opportunity. I am proud to announce that we have finally solved our ComCell puzzle. The cure for cancer is ours. It's a great leap forward, but not one without risks." He continued speaking in his self-aggrandizing manner, interspersing the word "we" frequently, although he had done very little to help the project in any way. It hardly mattered what he said, since the lead researchers weren't listening. They glanced back and forth from one to another, each wondering who had managed the impossible and what the breakthrough would mean to their position on the project. Only Twee did not look around. She was more interested in the gentleman in the black suit. Normally, the men who provided security for R&K Pharmaceuticals were aggressively anti-intellectual, most likely due to feelings of inadequacy. This man was different. His eyes were disarmingly soft and brown, but they were also shrewd. He watched the scientists, judging their reactions, seeing the fear in some and the haughty, godlike ego of others. He was literally in a room full of geniuses, but unlike the man in the gray suit next to him, he was completely unfazed. Twee was impressed, right up until he turned that piercing gaze on her. Their eyes locked, and her inner calm broke like glass. Her feelings were suddenly jumbled, and somehow he even seemed to notice this. She hadn't budged or jerked or reacted in any way. Still, he smirked in an irritatingly knowing manner before turning his chin slightly to look at Riggs. Riggs felt like he'd had the rug pulled out from under him. So far, his track of combining stem cells with alkaloid-producing fungi had shown the most promise in both the static carcinoma trials as well as with his favorite test animals, opossums. Still, there was no way he could claim that he had perfected his version of the ComCell. It was one of the others. He snuck a peek at Twee, forcing himself to look past her exotic beauty. It couldn't be her, he thought. Her choice of the fusarium mycotoxins was so weak that nobody had given her any chance. Riggs had never been worried about her. If anyone was going to find the cure, other than himself, that is, it would be Milner. Riggs would never admit it out loud, but he knew that Milner was smarter than he was. A glance in his direction, however, revealed the egotistical bastard looked about ready to shit his pants. Kip seemed to be enjoying the uptight, near-silent chaos he had sown. And thanks to my partner, who has spared no expense bribing every one of our top-rated sleazeball politicians, we have fast-track priority from the FDA, he concluded.
Meaning what exactly?
Twee asked. Kip's smile grew. Meaning, my dear Lee, that we begin human trials 5 weeks from today. Congratulations. The other scientists gaped at her, and only Riggs was able to force out the word, Congratulations. Far from being ecstatic, as Riggs would have been, Twee was irate.
"That's too soon," she said. "We need at least one more round of animal trials before—"
Kip cleared his throat loudly. "We will take that up later. First, we have some minor changes to announce. As of this moment, we are discontinuing the other track research projects." Riggs wanted to puke. 2 years' worth of work down the drain. What was worse in his mind was the fact that at best he would be relegated to some minor role in the new project, where he would receive a hearty handshake and an attaboy when the cure was perfected. At worst, he would be cut out completely. Then there was the very real possibility of being fired. With the economy as crappy as it had been for the past 5 years, research dollars were drying up, and with them, senior research positions seemed to be evaporating into thin air. Rothschild saw the looks of dismay around the table at hearing the good news. "I would like to thank you all for your hard work. You all deserve an attaboy for your perseverance and dedication. However, from this point, we will be advancing with a slightly smaller staff. Doctors Lee, Milner, and Riggs will be staying on. The rest of you—" Dr. Lipcomb leapt to his feet.
"I can't believe you picked her track! It's preposterous! Her work is crap! Her first trial showed only a 3% success rate, for God's sake! And her second was only a little better at 15!
The senior partner nodded to the facts. "Yes," Rothschild agreed. "A 500% increase in effectiveness. Her third trial was—" Again, Kip cleared his throat. "Not yet, Edmund. I'm sorry, Dr. Lipcomb, we have made our decision, which brings me to an introduction I should have begun with. This is our new Chief of Security, Mr. Ryan Deckard. He has some things to announce." The man in the black suit stood, glanced once at a small note, and said, "Doctors Lipcomb, Ragamesh, Beatty, Malinsky, and Walters, I will need all of your notes pertaining to your research by tomorrow at noon." Andre Beatty snorted. "Do you have an email address?" This was Beatty's idea of a joke. The data compiled by each scientist over the last few years was more than enough to fill the hard drives of 10 home computers. Beatty knew that emailing that much information would be a process of weeks. "You misunderstand," Deckard said. "I want your handwritten notes. The computers themselves are being seized as we speak." This created another outcry, larger than the first. Riggs barely heard. He was busy sighing in relief. The axe had fallen on someone else's head. Kip was glaring. "You each signed a contract. You each understand proprietary and intellectual property laws, and you each will comply with them, or you will be subject to more lawsuits than you can afford in 20 lifetimes. Rothschild made a face at Kip's heavy-handed tactics. "I'm sure threats aren't necessary. These are all ladies and gentlemen of honor." "Then explain the leak," Kip replied. The scientists had been whispering or grumbling under their breath, but at the word leak, they snapped their lips closed and again glanced around at each other. Seeing as any discovery was the intellectual property of the company they worked for, the quickest way, really the only way to get filthy rich as a scientist, was to play corporate spy. Undoubtedly, the cure for cancer would be worth billions to the pharmaceutical company that could patent it first. So it followed that any company falling behind would be willing to pay out tens of millions to the unethical man looking for the big payday. Rothschild could only shrug. "I can't explain the leak. However, I have full confidence in these men." "And I have full confidence in Mr. Deckard." Kip nodded to the security specialist. Deck had been eyeing the scientists closely during this exchange, none of whom dared to meet his gaze. "I appreciate it," Deckard said, without emotion, dismissing the talk of trust. "Now if we can clear the room." Under his intense gaze, the fired scientists filed out in various states of unhappiness. When they had left the room, Deck turned to glare at Kip. "My advice was not to discuss the leak. Now you've made my job much more difficult." Kip, who never liked it when someone pointed out a mistake of his, made a show of being unconcerned. "Maybe not. Perhaps we flush the culprit out into the open. Perhaps since he knows we're onto him, he'll try to rush things and make a mistake." Dr. Milner had been sitting this entire time, tapping his pen on his desk, his face twisted into a sneer. He cared nothing about leaks when it wasn't his own work. Clearly unhappy to have been beaten to the cure, he rounded on Twee. "How'd you do it?" Twee only smiled. like a cat sitting in a pile of golden canary feathers. Chapter 3. The Patients. 1. Eric von Braun, Sing Sing Prison, New York. Eric von Braun worked alone. He had no lookouts or anyone to watch his back in case things got hairy. He didn't have friends or accomplices, and he really didn't want any. He liked working alone because he never had to worry about anyone snitching or letting their tongue wag after a couple of snorts of this or that, and he never had to fear that some jackass would start bragging in a moment of manly stupidity. This self-enforced loneliness was why he was so successful at killing motherfuckers in the joint. For von Braun, there was only the name of his next victim and his payment, a dozen cartons of cigarettes. He didn't ask for instructions, and he didn't take requests in the manner in which his victim would die. He kept things simple, having only one rule. He would not kill a fellow white man, unless, of course, that man was a proven nigger lover. Then, von Braun, who looked like the poster boy for the Aryan nation, would cut his fee in half. Nothing burned his nerves and drove him into a rage more than a goddamn motherfucking nigger lover. This was not one of those times. This was a straight-up revenge killing. You kill one of mine, I'll kill one of yours. For the most part, he didn't give a rat's ass about the petty wars and stupid turf fights that went on in every prison in America. All he cared about was the kill, and this kill was only minutes from happening. With the heel of his leather glove, he wiped the sweat from his blue eyes and tried to relax in spite of the fact that his knees were folded up to his chin. The cabinet he'd forced himself into was black as night and hot as fuck. The air had long before turned stale and tasted used up. It was so friggin' suffocating that it felt like he had to shut himself up in his own coffin. That thought gave him a second of pause, and he had to fight the urge to crack the door and take a breath. Instead, he kicked the thought out of his mind and concentrated on the challenge ahead. Tonight was a two-part kill. First, the projectionist, who had the misfortune of simply being in the way, and then his real target, Malcolm Excalibur. What a dumbass nickname, von Braun whispered, trying to picture Malcolm. This wasn't an easy thing for him.